At the end of January 2020, a court-appointed administrator walked into a Nakumatt supermarket in a Nairobi suburb and turned off the lights for the last time. Nakumatt Holdings had been, at its peak, the largest organized retailer in East Africa. 65 stores across Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, and Rwanda. Revenue north of 50 billion Kenyan shillings. The first cross-border supermarket the region had ever produced. The last store closed with 38 billion shillings of unpaid debt behind it. Most of that debt was owed not to banks. It was owed to suppliers. The bread maker, the dairy, the Limuru tea processor, the Kenyan farmer who had delivered tomatoes to a Nakumatt distribution center and waited 120 days to be paid, and then 180, and then never. The largest retailer in East African history had been financed structurally by the working capital of the country's food producers. When the float collapsed, the chain collapsed with it. In the same week that the last Nakumatt store closed, a different supermarket chain was preparing to open 6 new stores of its own. It had been founded in a small Rift Valley town as a single-family shop in 2006. Its founder had died in 2016. His son had inherited it, and in September 2019, the family had quietly sold 100% of the company to a Mauritian private equity fund underwritten in large part by European development banks. This is the story of how Kenya's collapsed supermarket sector was restarted by a Nakuru family that walked away in time, and the patient capital that walked in behind them. Hi again, welcome back to the pod. My name is Farouk. And today we are going deep into the story of Quickmart, which today is Kenya's second largest supermarket chain behind only Naivas. The story of how Quickmart got there is, in many ways, the story of how Kenyan organized retail got rebuilt from scratch after the catastrophic collapse of Nakumatt, Tuskys, and Uchumi, 3 of the 4 largest chains in the country, in the space of about 6 years. It is also the story of a quietly historic transaction. The first time a Kenyan family supermarket sold 100% of itself to a private equity fund underwritten by European and multilateral development banks, with an explicit thesis that you could rebuild the country's supermarket sector if you stopped financing it the way it had always been financed. Whether that bet is working in 2026 is the question we are going to try to answer. Let's get into it. To tell the story of Quickmart, we have to start in Nakuru. Today, Nakuru is Kenya's 4th largest city. In 2006, it was a Rift Valley trading town of about 300,000 people, the regional center for the Central Highlands agricultural belt that grows much of Kenya's potatoes, maize, tomatoes, and dairy. It had a small but dense formal retail sector serving its civil servants, its small traders, and the farming families who came into town once a week to shop. The man who opened the first Quickmart store there in 2006 was a Kenyan businessman named John Kinuthia. The public record of John Kinuthia's life is thin. There is no Harvard Business School profile, no glossy magazine feature, no celebrated origin myth. There is a single shop in Nakuru in 2006 run by a working trader who had spent his career in commerce, which is to say, John Kinuthia did not begin the Quickmart story as one of Kenya's recognized supermarket families. He began it as a regional independent in a market that already had recognized supermarket families at much larger scale. The Kenyan supermarket families that John Kinuthia was competing with in 2006 were the giants of post-independence retail. Nakumatt, founded in Nakuru, of all places, by Atul Shah in 1987, was already on the path that would take it to 65 stores across 4 East African countries. Tuskys, founded by the Mukuha brothers, was on a similar arc. Uchumi was partially state-owned and listed on the Nairobi Securities Exchange. The conventional Kenyan supermarket business model in that decade was clear, simple, and, as it turned out, fatal. Buy on credit from suppliers. Sell to customers for cash. Pay the suppliers in 90 days. Then 120. Then 180. Use the gap to open more stores. Repeat until you run out of suppliers, or until the suppliers stop accepting your terms. In the industry that is sometimes called the supplier float. In Kenya, between 1987 and roughly 2015, The float financed the entire formal retail sector. The giants ran the largest float, opened the most stores, and were therefore the most dependent on the float continuing to refill. When it stopped refilling, the largest chains collapsed first. While the giants were running the float at full speed, John Kinuthia and his family were running Quickmart at a small fraction of their pace. By 2010, when John's son, Duncan Kinuthia, stepped into operational leadership of the chain, Quickmart was still a regional Nakuru and central Kenya business. By 2014, 8 years after founding, the chain had 4 branches. By the conventions of the era, that was not a serious retail company. It was a regional family shop. By the conventions of what came next, it was something more interesting. It was a chain that had not yet learned to live on supplier credit. 2016 was the year of 2 deaths in this story. The first was personal. John Kinuthia, the founder, died. The leadership of the chain passed entirely to his son Duncan and the rest of the Kinuthia family. The second death was structural. It was the year Nakumatt Holdings, the largest supermarket chain in East Africa, hit the wall on its supplier float. It had run out of suppliers willing to extend new credit. The first store closure would come the following year. The receivership would come the year after that. The largest organized retailer in East African history had begun, in 2016, the slow walk toward dissolution. Between 2017 and 2020, Nakumatt died in public. The first store closed in May 2017. The court receivership came in 2018. By the start of 2020, only 6 stores were still operating, and within weeks, they too were gone. Total debt had collapsed, around 38 billion Kenyan shillings, almost all of it owed to suppliers. The largest organized retailer in East African history had stopped paying for the bread, the milk, the meat, the tomatoes, the rice, and the soap that filled its shelves, until the suppliers refused to send any more. Tuskys followed almost immediately. Same model, same fate, slightly slower clock. Tuskys began missing supplier payments in 2018, was placed on the government watch list of distressed retailers, and ran its last branch into closure in March 2023. Total debt had collapsed, 19.6 billion shillings. Uchumi, partially state-owned, had been a perpetual restructuring story for a decade and was, by the early 2020s, effectively dormant. 3 of Kenya's 4 largest supermarket chains had, between 2017 and 2023, ceased to operate. The 4th survivor, Naivas, kept growing. And in the gap left by the 3 failures, a window opened. The window was real. Suppliers who had been paid late or not at all for years were desperate for a retailer who would pay them on time. Mall landlords who had built their entire footprint around a Nakumatt anchor tenant were watching their flagship stores go dark and were prepared to renegotiate hard with anyone who could backfill the space. Customers who had built their weekly grocery routines around a Nakumatt or a Tuskys were standing in front of locked doors, looking for somewhere else to go. The entire formal retail sector of Kenya had been knocked back to a smaller scale, and the chains that survived had the chance to capture it. The 2 best positioned were both Nakuru companies. Naivas, controlled by the Mukuha family, which is a separate Mukuha family from the Mukuha brothers of Tuskys, and a different operating culture entirely. And Quickmart, with 8 stores, fresh past the founder's death, run by a Kinuthia son who was about to make the most important decision in the company's history. The decision Duncan Kinuthia faced in 2018 was the most important decision the Quickmart story would ever produce and the most under-discussed in the Kenyan business press. He had 3 real options. He could try to scale the way Nakumatt had scaled, on supplier credit, watching the float carefully and hoping he was a better manager than Atul Shah. He could try to scale on bank debt, pledging Kinuthia family assets as collateral and betting his inheritance on the next store opening. Or he could sell the company to a professional investor who would supply the capital in exchange for control and let his family continue to run the operating business as employees. He chose the third option. Atul Shah, 15 years earlier, had chosen the first. That is the difference between the 2 stories. The buyer was based in Port Louis. Adenia Partners, a Mauritius-headquartered private equity firm founded in 2002, was raising its 4th fund, a €230 million vehicle called Adenia Capital 4, focused on majority buyouts of mid-cap sub-Saharan African companies. The most important fact about Adenia Capital 4 is the composition of its limited partners. More than 40% of the fund came from European and multilateral development finance institutions. The Belgian Development Bank, BO, the French Development Bank, Proparco, the British Development Bank, then known as the CDC Group, now British International Investment, the German, Austrian, and Swedish development banks, the International Finance Corporation of the World Bank Group, and the European Investment Bank. That is to say, when Adenia Capital 4 bought Quickmart, the check was substantially underwritten by European and multilateral development capital. The thesis behind that capital was straightforward, even if it has rarely been stated in public in quite this way. African organized retail had a structural problem. The supplier credit model was killing the chains and the suppliers together. Patient, equity-style development capital, deployed through a professional PE manager, could rebuild the sector on a more durable model. Kenya, mid-collapse, was the obvious test market. Adenia's Kenyan special-purpose vehicle, Sokoni Retail Kenya, was the operating structure. The first acquisition closed in October 2018 when Sokoni bought 100% of Tumaini Self-Service Limited, a 13-store chain operating in Nairobi, Kiambu, Kajiado, and Kisumu. The Quickmart deal followed in 2019. The Competition Authority of Kenya filings are explicit and worth pausing on because the press coverage at the time was loose with the numbers. The transaction was the acquisition of 100% of the issued shares in Quickmart Limited by Sokoni Retail Kenya, approved by CAK unconditionally in August 2019, formally completed on the 19th of September. The combined post-merger entity, Quickmart plus Tumaini, under a single Quickmart brand, opened with 23 stores between them. By the standards of the post-Nakumatt market, that was a small chain. By the standards of Nakuru, in 2006, John Kanuthia's single shop had become, in its second life, something none of its founders had set out to build: a national retail platform owned by European Development Capital. The first 2 years after the merger were spent doing the unglamorous work of integration. Tumaini staff trained on Quickmart systems, Quickmart staff trained on Tumaini suppliers, central buying consolidated, IT systems unified, 2 regional cultures brought together under one operating model. Then, in 2021, Quickmart did something none of its competitors did that year. It opened 6 new stores, the most of any Kenyan supermarket chain in 2021, most of them in locations that had, until 12 months earlier, been Nakumatt anchor stores. The mall landlords had needed a tenant, and Quickmart, freshly capitalized by Adenia, was the only chain that could move that fast on commercially viable terms. By the middle of 2022, Quickmart had 53 stores. By the middle of 2023, 58, across 16 counties. By the end of 2025, 63, with the most recent opening at the Basic Mall on Banana Road in Ruaka, a community-scale neighborhood store in a Kiambu suburb that, in 2015, had been a small village. The public 5-year plan, set in 2022, was to reach 105 stores in Kenya by the end of 2026. Annual revenue target, around $540 million United States dollars, roughly 70 billion shillings. The operating leadership of the chain settled into a stable shape. Peter Kangiri, who had joined as a consultant in 2013 with a brief to professionalize the human capital structure, became CEO at the time of the merger. Duncan Kanuthia, the founder's son, remained as managing director, providing the operational continuity between the Kanuthia family era and the Adenia era. The workforce, which had been a few hundred at the merger, grew through 6,000 and now 7,000. The strategic move that mattered most was, again, the one that did not show up in the store count. Quickmart, under Adenia governance, paid its suppliers on contractually agreed terms, predictably, in full. It is a remarkable thing to have to highlight as a strategic differentiator, but in the Kenyan supermarket market of the early 2020s, that was an actual differentiator. The bread maker who had spent 5 years chasing Nakumatt for payment, the dairy that had written off its Tuskys receivables, the Limuru tea processor that had given up on Uchumi, all of them found in Quickmart a counterparty that paid them in the time it had said it would. The Kenyan suppliers, who had been the structural creditors of the previous generation of supermarket failures, became, under Quickmart, the structural enablers of the next generation of supermarket growth. 600 direct suppliers, 14,000 farmer suppliers, 40,000 SKUs. The strategic posture by 2025 had also shifted. The first wave of post-merger expansion had relied heavily on anchor tenant slots in large shopping malls vacated by Nakuru. By 2025, the Knight Frank H2 Retail Report was documenting an industry-wide pivot away from mall anchors and toward community-scale neighborhood stores. Quickmart, Naivas, and Carrefour were all making the same shift at the same time, in roughly the same direction. The middle-income Kenyan suburb, with 3,000 to 5,000 households within walking distance, became the structural unit of Kenyan supermarket growth. The chains were no longer competing for the same mall floor. They were competing for the same suburb. The story of Quickmart between 2019 and 2026 is a story of operational success. The store count is real. The supplier model is real. The employment is real. The development finance underwriting that made the whole thing possible is real. But the central structural question, whether Quickmart is genuinely a different kind of supermarket business, or whether it is the same supermarket business with a more durable balance sheet, has not yet been definitively answered. It cannot be answered until at least three things happen. The first thing is the Adenia exit. Adenia Capital 4 is, by industry convention, a 7 to 10-year hold investment. The fund acquired Quickmart in September 2019. That puts the exit window between 2026 and 2029. We are, as of this episode, inside that window. Three pathways are being actively discussed in the Kenyan financial press. A trade sale to a strategic acquirer, possibly South Africa's Shoprite, possibly Carrefour's Kenyan operator Majid Al Futtaim, possibly an East African industrial family, an IPO on the main board of the Nairobi Securities Exchange, which would put Quickmart in the company of Kenya's blue-chip consumer equities, or a secondary buyout to a larger Africa-focused PE fund. Each of those exits would produce a different kind of Quickmart. A South African strategic with quarterly margin pressure looks very different from a Nairobi Securities Exchange listing. The decision is not Quickmart's. It is Adenia's. The next chapter of the chain will be written by whoever signs the check to buy it. The second open question is the development finance question itself. In 2024, the long-form magazine The Conversationalist published a substantial argument that the use of European development capital to consolidate African organized retail does not necessarily help the small farmers it claims to serve. Supermarket procurement is, by design, large-scale, contract-based, price-disciplined, and risk-shifting. The 14,000 farmer suppliers in the Quickmart network are not, by and large, subsistence smallholders. They are commercial growers operating at the smaller end of commercial scale. The structural transition the development finance bet is funding may, in net, displace as many small traders as it formerly helps farmers. That argument is not a knockdown of the Adenia strategy, but it is a fair structural criticism, and it is still being debated in 2026. The third open question is the structural flaw. 70% of Kenyans, by the Competition Authority's own data, still buy their daily food from the informal sector. The corner shop, the Mama Mboga vegetable stall, the open market. Every conversation about Quickmart's growth, Naivas's growth, Carrefour's growth, the whole post-Nakuru restart of formal retail is happening inside the remaining 30%. That is a much smaller pond than the headline store counts make it look. The assumption that the formal retail share will roughly double from 15% of grocery spending in 2020 to around 25% by the end of the decade is the central commercial bet of every supermarket chain in the country. It is a real bet. It is not a baseline. Today, at the end of June 2026, Quickmart is the second largest supermarket chain in Kenya by store count. 63 stores in 16 counties, approximately 7,000 direct employees, 600 direct suppliers, 14,000 farmer suppliers, 40,000 SKUs. A growing online business through quickmart.co.ke. A public target of 105 stores by the end of the year. The brand that John Kinuthia opened as a single shop in Nakuru in 2006 is 20 years later, owned by a Mauritian private equity fund that was itself underwritten by European and multilateral development banks. The founding family is operationally represented in the building through Duncan Kanuthia's continuing role as managing director. But the ownership of the company has been completely transferred. The decision to make that transfer in 2019 was the most important decision the Quickmart story has produced. It is also the decision that the Atul Shahs of Nakumatt, the Mukuha brothers of Tuskies, and the Kago family of Uchumi did not make in time. There is perhaps a thematic rhyme worth pulling on. In the same year that Pan-African Paper Mills, the country's most ambitious industrial restart, was being rebuilt by Jaswant Singh Rai at Webuye with a captive power line and 3 billion shillings of family capital. Quickmart, the country's most ambitious retail restart, was being scaled by a Mauritian PE fund at Nakuru and across 16 Kenyan counties with 230 million euros of European development capital. Different sectors, different capital structures, different kinds of owner, but the same underlying observation. Kenyan organized business in the 2020s is being rebuilt in some of its most important corners by the capital that the Kenyan public market and the Kenyan banking system, on their own, did not provide. The next chapter of the story is the Adenia exit. By the end of 2029 at the latest, the ownership of Quickmart Limited will have changed hands again. Whoever signs that cheque will inherit a chain that has been deliberately rebuilt on a non-Nakumatt model. Patient capital, predictable supplier payment, community-scale store growth. The single most important question for the future of Kenyan organized retail is whether the next owner keeps that model running or whether they revert to the older, faster, more fragile growth-on-the-float playbook that put 38 billion shillings of unpaid supplier debt into the ground at Nakumatt. The structural answer that 2026 can offer is partial. The old model is dead. The new model is working. Whether the new model survives its first ownership transition is the question the next 3 years will answer. In 2006, a Kenyan trader opened a single self-service shop in a Rift Valley town and called it Quickmart. In 2016, he died. In 2019, his son sold the company in full to a Mauritian private equity fund that was itself underwritten, in large part, by European development banks. Today, 20 years after that first shop opened in Nakuru, Quickmart is the second largest supermarket chain in Kenya, in the middle of a deliberate national rollout, paid for by patient capital that the previous generation of Kenyan supermarket founders did not have access to and, in most cases, did not ask for. The largest organized retailer in East African history is dead. The chain that walked into the vacuum it left behind is, for now, alive. This is Asili Africa. Every empire has an origin. That is the story. And like every story worth telling, this one is still being written. If this episode made you see something differently, share it with someone who needs to hear it. I am Farouk. This is Asili Africa. Every empire has an origin. Now you know this one. So, start building, because yours might be tomorrow's origin story. See you on the next one.